You just saw an overview of me doing this tapered curving inlay in this board. I'm going to walk you through the process again. The board is going to look a little different. It's going to look more like this one, but it's the same process. I wanted to give you the highlights first because when you get into all the details, sometimes things just seem more complicated than they really are. The first step is going to be making these strips that are tapered in the middle. So what we're doing here is instead of cutting a curve into a straight piece of wood, we just bend the piece of wood and make a straight cut in it, and then when it straightens out, it's curved. When it straightens out, it's curved. That makes sense. So the first jig that I made that you saw in the videos just has 3 points of contact. It holds the strip at the two ends, and then it pushes it out in the middle. I've since made another version of that works a lot better, and it's a little bit longer. So one of the problems that you find with this approach is the strip needs to be quite a bit longer than what you're going to end up with that's usable because of the way it's held at the ends. So you need about 3 inches on each end. That's just going to be waste. The other part of this is I've added all of these intermediate clamps. So what I found is when you first put the strip in there, it's under a lot of tension because it's being bent and it's fairly thick. But in the middle of the cut, as you're making it thinner, then it starts to lose all that tension and it can pull away from the stops. So it really helps to have it just clamp down as much as possible so it doesn't spring out and get cut wrong. What I think makes this technique so useful is assuming your table saw is up to the task and you do a good job of clamping it down in the jig, the strips are going to come off the saw glue line ready. And I really can't think of any other way of making these where that's true. So now we need something to actually do with this thing. And I'm in kind of a cutting board making mode. So I made this thing. And since I made this up out of scraps, by doing that, I've kind of made the wood grain irrelevant. Whereas, say, a board like this, it's got its own thing happening here, whereas I've artificially created this pattern which is stronger than the wood grain. So I was looking at this board and I was thinking about inlaying something in here like this. It's a little too narrow for a cutting board, but I was playing around with trying to make this work, and maybe something like this could work, maybe. But I wasn't too excited about that, and because it was too narrow, I went and got this beast right here, which is quite wide for walnut. And I really couldn't come up with any way of putting this in here that I was happy with, and that I felt like it really added anything to this thing, which was already beautiful. So I got to thinking about how to use this in a way that would enhance the grain of the wood. Work with it rather than just kind of forcing my will upon it like I did with this. So I came up with this guy, which I think is a more effective use of this than that. So I went looking through my stash and I found boards that had a curving grain. And if I put two of those together, then I'm creating this space in between them that is wider at the ends and narrow in the middle, which is exactly what I can fill in with my strips if I stack them together. So on this board, I started out first with the walnut board, and I cut the curve into here. And I tried to follow the grain as best as I could, and then I worked my way trying to manipulate this in a way that would match up with what was over here. So since these strips are longer than the board, I can shift this left and right to kind of manipulate what's happening here. So I started out with the narrowest point at the apex of this curve. And then with each one of these, I shifted it over a little bit to kind of get it more towards where this one was. It's not super noticeable, but on this side, this is about 2 3/4. And on this side, this is about 2 1/2. So there was a little bit more to it than just putting these strips in here and hoping for the best. However, it didn't quite work out because I was actually trying to match it to this hickory board rather than this maple board, and it didn't work out. And the reason for that is because this grain comes back out, whereas my inlay is flaring out the opposite way at the end. So I'm going to try this again, and this time I made a couple of strips that are just tapered. So I'm hoping that this could kind of offset for the way that this is coming out. And also, rather than starting from one end and working towards this board, I'm going to start from both boards at the same time and try to meet up in the middle. So I'm going to use the same approach of putting strips that are matched this board against this board and the strips that match this board against this board. So I've got walnut and hickory sapwood. And in the middle, I'm going to put some of the hickory heartwood. I don't have any other hickory heartwood in the shop besides this board that's long enough. So I had to take a couple of strips off the edge. One of these I'm going to make tapered, but it's not long enough to use the jig, so I'm going to have to use the board stretcher. And this other one, I'm going to leave as a full 1/4 inch strip. I'm going to glue that in the middle, and I'm going to use this to make up any difference between the two sides. Of course, I immediately ran into a problem. The strip couldn't bend around that tight of a curve without breaking. So I flattened out that curve a little bit, and I also started removing material from the strips in that area. I did that on my edge sander, which has a very large drum on one end. I held the strip against a couple of blocks to help keep it square. After the first round of adding strips, with the edges of the two boards parallel to each other, you can tell I've got a much larger space on one side than the other. And I realized I can always just cheat and angle one of them. I think I ended up going through 4 stages of adding strips. It's a little tricky because you can't really see what the gap between the two boards is going to be until you've already done what you've done. So you have to kind of sneak up on it. But I finally got it to the point where the gap is small enough that I can bridge it with this wider strip, which I've already off camera soaked in water and then clamped to the curve to get it to bend. So now I need to transfer that curve onto the other side. And to do that, I'm going to use a negative template. First, I attached some template material to the positive side. Here I'm using 6mm Baltic birch because it needs to be something hard enough that the bearing is not going to crush into it and distort the shape. But it also needs to be thin enough that we can cut through it in one pass on the router. Because I'm taking this to the router table and I'm cutting through it with a 1/4-inch flush trim bit. It's important to keep the bearing of the flush trim bit against the stock the entire time, because we're actually interested in the offcut side of this template. That's the negative template. So I have my negative template, and if I put it up against the positive side again, they don't perfectly match each other. It's a little bit open at the ends. I can just kind of rock the template back and forth a little bit. And the reason for that is because we removed a 1/4 inch of material, and that changed the radius of the curves, so they don't quite match each other anymore. Now, I think every other video on the internet talking about negative templates starts out by showing you this extreme example, something like this, and they show you that the two templates don't match each other, and they'll tell you that the only way to overcome this is to use a flush trim bit with an oversized bearing. So this bearing overhangs the cutting edge by the same diameter of the bit that we used to remove that material. So it offsets the cutting edge back to where it was on the positive side of the template, and it makes it match perfectly. But we don't have those extreme curves in our project. We made this curve by bending wood, and wood doesn't bend that extremely. And as you see in my template, it almost matches. And all I really have to do is put clamps on the end of this and squeeze it, and the gaps will go away. And the main reason I'm doing that is because I don't have a whole lot of wiggle room in this strip on here. So I need to align the template on here pretty precisely. And in order to use this, I have to offset the template by a 1/4 inch, which makes it a lot harder to get this aligned perfectly. My advice is test the two templates against each other. And if they're really close, you don't have to bother with this. Now, some of you are probably thinking this was too complicated, and if you have the ability to copy a curve from one board onto another, why not forget all of this strip nonsense and just put a third board in between here? And you could do that, but it brings us back to where we started. By using the strips, I was able to create my own grain pattern in here, and it looks like it belongs in between these two boards. So what you'd have to do is find 3 boards with grain that match each other. If you could find that, it would probably look something like this.